Welcome back to our channel, Alimentary, my dear,
where we make nutrition science easy for you to digest.
Today we answer the question, do your genes make you look fat?
Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of our videos. Are you sick of being told to just eat less and move more?
If you did that, you'd be in perfect, healthy condition.
It turns out it might not be that simple.
When it comes to something like obesity, there often is a lot of pressure and blame put on the individual. Like you said, often the advice, even from healthcare professionals, is, well, just eat better, just exercise more, you'll be fine. That's all it takes, right? More and more evidence is coming to light that that's just not true. Even though calories in, calories out is kind of true, what actually goes into the calories in and what actually goes into the calories out might be a lot more complex and nuanced than we thought before. And not all of it is in our control.
Even within the realm of healthcare practitioner, we still operate from this calories in, calories out, just move more, eat less, and also this moral high ground. That's actually a really huge problem for people who are overweight and obese. That results in worse healthcare outcomes.
This underlying ideology leads to weight stigma, which is discriminatory acts or views towards people based on their weight and size. This can be explicit or implicit. For example, in mass media, we often see people in larger bodies being portrayed in very negative ways, whether it's TV shows, movies, or even songs. And this has real world implications. Being exposed to weight stigma can lead to poor self-esteem, poor body image, depression, anxiety, poor social relationships, being turned down for jobs, poor treatment within the healthcare system.
Weight stigma actually has the opposite of the intended effect. I think a lot of people think, oh, if we just shame fat people, there will be no more fat people. People will just be so ashamed that they're gonna stop eating and be skinny. It's just really not true. A lot of the stress that comes along with the stigma leads actually to increased weight gain. That can be because, from a physiological sense, you're increasing cortisol, and cortisol kind of tells your body to start storing stuff when it's elevated for a long period of time.
To give perspective into how complex obesity actually is, there's a really cool visual called the Foresight obesity map. This diagram shows over 100 variables across 7 domains, all of which have a complex interplay with each other and can affect the energy balance that might lead to obesity. Biology, psychology, energy consumption, and physical activity, but also the activity environment, the food environment, and social influences. Just based on those headings, you can probably see how some things might be within our control, but the majority of those categories are actually not.
This is the nuance that's really needed when we talk about that energy in, energy out framework. We even talk about the energy in, energy out when it comes to weight loss, because at the end of the day, that is the physics of it. You can't cheat physics, but what's going into the energy in and energy out is so complex that simple advice of just move more or just eat less really doesn't even scrape the surface.
Today we're going to focus specifically on the biology part of this entire complex map, and specifically we're going to talk about genetics. Believe it or not, there is a genetic component that affects energy balance that might lead to obesity.
This is kind of a newer area. We've really only known what the human genome looked like for the past 20 or so years. When we were first looking into the genome, we thought, oh, it's gonna be easy. This gene does this, and then this gene does this, and if you have this variation of this gene, then you're gonna have brown eyes, and if you have this variation of this gene, you're gonna have blue eyes. But contrary to what you learned in grade 11 biology or whatever it was, the outcomes of what your genes are a lot more complex than, the genetics for eye color.
That being said, genetics for obesity can be viewed as monogenic or polygenic. The monogenic is kind of more in line with kind of the simple genetic formula where there's a certain specific genetic variation or mutation that can lead to a specific outcome. Now, when it comes to obesity, something like a monogenic genetic contribution is very rare. They tend to be severe, but they do tend to be very rare. What's more common is polygenic obesity, which is where there's a complex interplay of hundreds of genetic variations that might all be influencing that energy balance in different ways. Genome sequencing research is relatively new and we're still very much in the early stages, but we've known for a while that there is a genetic component to things like body weight. Research in the past would often look at what's happening within a household or a family structure. For example, comparing something like identical twins to regular non-twin siblings or adopted siblings. That's done in order order to kind of account for the fact that even within a family, even though there's shared genetics, there's also shared food environment, maybe similar schools, similar social structures and interactions. So often it's difficult to tease out what exactly is happening. Comparing these different pairs is often a useful way to tease out the difference between the genetic component and the environmental component. And it's super interesting because when you look at identical twins versus fraternal twins versus non-twin siblings, parent-child pairings, spouses, or adopted relatives, we find that it pretty much goes in the exact order that you would think, where the correlation of BMI between identical twins is the highest and adopted relatives is the lowest.
This kind of research has been going on since the 80s, and what they found is that BMI has 40 to 70% heritability. About 40 to 70% of what your BMI is can be attributed to those genes that are passed on to you. Now that we have more information about the whole human genome, we've been doing a lot more really cool experiments where we're looking at specific genes and how they influence weight. One that's been studied the most is something called the FTO gene. They've actually found that people have a certain variation of this gene weigh around 3 kilograms more than people who don't. And that seems really small, and you might be like, okay, well, that doesn't really attribute to obesity because the difference between being a normal weight and being obese is not 3 kilograms. People who have a certain variation of this gene have a 1.67-fold increase of the risk of obesity. Even just this one gene that's been the most studied, we do see it has a significant impact on someone's risk of obesity.
So now let's talk about calories in, calories out, and where the genetic influences might have a role. First up, when it comes to calories out or energy expenditure, one of the main components of it is your resting metabolic rate. This is how much energy your body needs at rest. If you're just laying around all day, not eating, not digesting, not moving, not doing anything, your body would still need quite a bit of calories just to do that, believe it or not.
For most people, this is actually kind of the bulk of the calories that you burn in a day. Genetics play a big role in the amount of energy you use at rest because your genes dictate how your body processes things and does different things, and it's all these little processes that happen in your body that make up this RMR. A lot of these studies on genetics and heritability on resting metabolic rate, even after controlling for things like fat-free mass, age, sex, show that heritability plays about a 40% influence on what your RMR is, which is pretty interesting, especially because they controlled for things like fat-free mass, and fat-free mass is influenced by genetics and is also an influence of resting metabolic rate.
Your resting metabolic rate is largely influenced by things like height and weight, meaning generally speaking, people in larger bodies, people that are taller, would tend to just need more calories just to survive. Some observational research actually shows that even when you adjust for something like body weight, people with lower BMIs have higher resting metabolic rates.
There is also a genetic component to body composition. Genetics can influence whether or not you're more likely to build muscle or store fat, and also can influence whether or not when you're in a caloric restriction, whether you're gonna have, that big decrease in metabolic rate that we often talk about, we call that metabolic adaptation, or if that decrease isn't gonna be as big. And that has really big influences for weight loss. We have this narrative of, oh, just do this and you're gonna eat less and you're gonna lose all this weight. It's on you, but really, it's also on your genetics.
Another part of the energy out or calories out equation is physical activity. This idea of, just move more is often thrown around. But believe it or not, there might actually be a genetic component to people's propensity to participate in physical activity versus sedentary behaviors.
I think we think of behavior as largely like a psychological thing, but it really does make sense if you think about it that your genes and your genetic makeup can influence your behaviors. The thing is that it's really hard to measure behaviors and measure the heritability of behaviors because we're studying twins. Oftentimes, your parents are just gonna throw you in the same activity, or if we're studying a family, it's kind of, you have those families that are like, the biking families and all of them bike everywhere and they bike to the grocery store, and then you have the families that don't do that. But when they do look at family and twin studies, the range is pretty big in terms of what the heritability is. Somewhere between 9% to 80%. Big question marks there.
One of the possible mechanisms is variations in people's reward responses. Our brains have a whole reward mechanism that's in place to reinforce different behaviors. For example, if you eat something that tastes really good, our brains tend to respond to that by releasing neurotransmitters and hormones that make you feel really good, and that's likely to lead you to repeat that behavior in the future. It turns out that when it comes to something like physical activity, it's thought that there might be differences in how our brains process that and whether or not that activity is rewarding or not. So for some people, physical activity might be more rewarding than for other people.
I think that makes a lot of sense because you see those people who are like, I'm running a half marathon every other weekend and I'm exercising every single day, and then you have other people
Look at that and think that they're just torturing themselves.
Absolutely. Another potential mechanism is maybe some people just have the genes that mean that they don't really get as tired from physical activity as other people. If they are on a walk, they're fine to go the extra 30 minutes, where someone else is like, listen, I'm done. We know that a lot of athletes have specific genetics that make them really good at their sports. And some of those are the fact that they don't get as tired or don't produce as many of the chemicals that make your muscles hurt. A lot of what we just mentioned were hypotheses that came around when we were doing these heritability studies. But now that we've been able to sequence the genome and do more specific research on genes, we actually have identified potential mechanisms and potential genes of interest when it comes to resting metabolic rate and physical activity. Some studies have looked at the LEPR gene and found that it is associated with different levels of physical activity. Some people who have certain variants may have lower or higher physical activity depending on what variation of that gene it is.
And then in mice, we find that mice that have lower levels of a specific genetic protein, which is CADM, they tend to exhibit more locomotor activity without increased food intake.
Both of those genes that we just discussed are actually associated with differences in BMI, whether it be mouse BMI or human BMI. And in mice, CADM gene is associated with adiposity and insulin sensitivity, which both have linkages to body weight.
What we were talking about before is more about intentional exercise, but another component of the entire physical activity part of the energy expenditure is what we call non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. NEAT includes things like fidgeting, pacing, walking around, maybe being very animated with your talking. All of those things go into non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It's all the physical movements that don't actually entail intentional physical exercise. What we find is that there might be genetic variations in how much NEAT people participate in. For instance, there's what we call the energy compensation hypothesis. Essentially the idea that when people eat more, that your body might have automatic subconscious compensatory mechanisms to make you move more. It's not something that we notice or are intentionally doing, it's just what may naturally happen. So if you eat more one day, your energy expenditure may also be increased that day because of that increase in NEAT. But it's thought that perhaps people in larger bodies, maybe this compensation isn't happening quite in the same way.
The thing with this energy compensation theory is that it kind of goes both ways. So if you are eating less, you might move less. And the same thing applies, is it's thought that a lot of these behaviors come from your brain, your hypothalamus. That's kind of the thermostat for your body to keep everything regulated. There likely is a genetic component because your genes code for all the proteins and things that your hypothalamus is making.
That being said, we haven't quite gotten to the point where we can pinpoint exactly what the genetics are.
But we do know that there are certain people who are more animated. I am a huge pacer. I hate sitting down. You ask any of my grade school teachers, hated me. To use anecdote, I see a lot of the same behaviors in my mom. I'm a huge hand talker. You're a pretty big hand talker too.
I think, a hand talker. People make fun of me for that. But talking with you is interesting because normally, when you're hanging out with someone, you're probably all sitting down. Whereas with her, I feel like you're just like walking around, pacing here and there. And I feel like a lazy bum just like sitting still the whole time.
Get on my level.
I actually do stand up when you stand up now.
Positive influence on people's NEAT. You might think, okay, well, fidgeting, how much energy does that really burn? But it can make huge differences. As dietitians, we've been taught that when we're working with people who have maybe neurological conditions, where they're having fidgeting or ticking or stimming or any kind of repetitive movement, we actually really need to take that into account when we're doing energy requirements, because that can really add up.
Now let's flip over to the other side of the equation. calories in. Believe it or not, there may be a genetic component to what drives us to eat and how much we eat and what we want to eat as well.
Remember that FTO gene that we talked about a few minutes ago? The most studied gene when it comes to what are the influence of genetics on body weight or BMI. As you mentioned, genetics is kind of in its infancy. People get really excited by this idea of like, oh, I can eat specifically for my genes. But a lot of it's kind of speculation. But one of the best ways that we can speculate is looking at where is this gene expressed the most? And so the FTO gene is actually expressed in the hypothalamus, thermostat of your body. When we look at the hypothalamus, we see that this FTO gene is expressed quite a bit, especially in the regions that moderate energy intake, as well as things like where we get our motivation from, reward centers of the brain. This has led scientists to think, okay, maybe this is one of the ways that the FTO gene influences weight. It has to do with controlling how much energy you intake, how much reward you get from what you intake.
It's incredible because we actually see this being played out in research that's done in mice, where when it comes to the FTO genetic protein, mice that have lower levels of that tend to be more lean, whereas mice that have an overexpression of the FTO protein seem to be overweight. Researchers have actually also identified a whole host of other genes where mutations of these genes might lead to differences in reward processing, food intake, taste preferences, and ultimately body weight as well.
The science of genetics and their influence on body weight is in its infancy, but I think in the coming decades, we're gonna see a lot of new research on specific genes or combinations of genes.
I think I can hear a possible argument coming from people, which is, well, this whole quote-unquote obesity epidemic is relatively a recent development in human history, so how can it all be genetics? Obviously, from an evolutionary perspective, genetics take a lot longer to change, so how can you blame it all on genetics? First of all, like we said in the beginning, we're not blaming it all on genetics. This is just one component of it, but it is a largely influential component. And it's also important to remember that genetics don't just exist in a vacuum. It interacts with the environment, and the environment has changed so much. For example, we talked about variations in the reward response to certain activities, whether it's the type of food that you're eating, the amount of food that you're eating, or physical activity. When you think about those types of variations, and you think about what the food environment or the activity environment was like decades and centuries ago, in the past, even if you didn't enjoy physical activity, chances are you still had to move around a lot more to get food, get to wherever you're going, whatever, all the things that you had to do in your life. Even entertainment probably involved a lot more physical activity than the type of entertainment that we have available now. Even if intentional exercise wasn't something that you enjoyed, based on that activity environment, you probably still moved around a lot.
A lot of our jobs right now have really changed to be sedentary. Instead of, working in the farms where, if you wanted to make a living or you wanted to feed your family, you had to move. A lot of us are online doing a little 9 to 5. That's like a solid 8+ hours of the day where people normally would have been active and no longer are. And if you don't have that reward of, oh, I love exercising, you're less likely to go out and seek that. Looking to the other side of the equation, we have a very, very different food environment. If we're talking about food reward, the types of foods we have now are very different from what we had in the past. If you have a genetic predisposition to preferring certain foods that are more available now, that are typically calorically dense, high in fat, sugar, etc., then this environment could influence your body mass index.
Going back to that foresight obesity map, there's so many areas and domains that affect energy balance and weight. Today, we just kind of scratched the surface on one component, which is genetics or biology, one of the major components where we don't have direct control. But there's so many other domains, including the activity environment and the food environment, and maybe even the sociocultural context, that we don't have direct control over. The purpose of this video is essentially to just draw attention to the bigger picture, furthering the conversation on, are we focusing on the wrong thing?
The way that our past frameworks for what are the causes of the obesity epidemic have really been lacking, and this shift in blame towards individuals really isn't warranted and also is not science-based. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss one of our videos, and follow us on our Instagram and our TikTok.
Thank you for watching.
Bye!